Picture this. You're at a fancy restaurant. The lights are dim, the waiter sets down a tray of oysters on crushed ice, and you're about to impress your date with your sophisticated palate. But here's the kicker. 2 centuries ago, those same oysters weren't a delicacy at all. In fact, they were more like the pizza slices or street tacos of their time. Cheap, greasy, and sold by the bucket. That's right, oysters were once considered junk food. So how did they climb the social ladder from working-class snack to fine dining luxury? Stick around because the story is as slippery as the oyster itself, right here on History of Food. In the 1700s and 1800s, oysters were everywhere. America's coastlines, especially around New York, Baltimore, and New Orleans, were loaded with oyster beds. They were so abundant that for most people, oysters weren't glamorous. They were just dinner. New Yorkers in the 1800s devoured an estimated 600 million oysters a year. To put that in perspective, that's almost 2 oysters a day for every man, woman, and child. And these weren't tucked away in white tablecloth restaurants. They were being sold on street corners, hawked from barrels, and baked into pies. They were, quite literally, the fast food of the working class. If you wanted a quick, cheap night out in 19th century New York, you didn't head to a burger joint. You headed underground to an oyster cellar. For just a few pennies, you could chow down on a plate of oysters with a mug of beer. These cellars were crowded, noisy, and often a little questionable in terms of cleanliness. Think less Michelin star, more dive bar. Still, they were wildly popular. Sailors, dock workers, and laborers packed in nightly, slurping oysters like we inhale fries today. They were quick, salty, filling, and most importantly, cheap. Here's the thing. Oysters were one of the few foods that crossed class lines. The poor ate them raw on the docks, while the rich served them dressed up at fancy banquets. Same oyster, different plating. For the elite, oysters might come on silver trays with elaborate sauces. For the working class, it was just grab and slurp. This dual life gave oysters a unique place in food culture. They weren't just junk food, they were everyone's food. The oyster craze. By the mid-19th century, oysters weren't just a meal, they were an industry. Baltimore became the oyster capital of America, with massive shucking houses employing thousands of workers. Oyster shells paved roads, fertilized fields, and even ended up in construction. Entire cities practically ran on oysters, and when supplies ran low, things got messy. There were even oyster riots in New York. Imagine rioting in the streets because McDonald's ran out of fries. That's how intense the oyster craze was. The oyster craze also fueled some of the earliest forms of street food branding. Vendors carved out personalities. Some yelled catchy slogans, while others became known for tossing oysters into your tin plate like they were pitching baseballs. Imagine Times Square, but instead of glowing billboards for soda, you've got guys hollering, "Oysters, fresh and salty, cheaper than bread." It was chaotic, loud, and exactly what you'd expect from a nation that hadn't discovered cheeseburgers yet. But here's the downside. Everyone assumed oysters were infinite. Spoiler alert, they weren't. Overfishing decimated oyster beds while growing cities polluted coastal waters. Suddenly, oysters weren't just cheap and tasty, they were risky. Outbreaks of cholera were sometimes traced back to contaminated oysters. What was once junk food for all started to look like food poisoning for the unlucky. By the early 20th century, oyster populations had collapsed. Scarcity transformed them from an everyday snack into a rare delicacy. Prices shot up and oysters became synonymous with fine dining instead of working-class taverns. Scarcity created status. The oyster had flipped from French fry to filet mignon in the span of a few decades. America wasn't alone. In Victorian England, oysters were also street food. Londoners ate them with bread and beer, and Charles Dickens mentioned them in his novels as the go-to snack for ordinary folks. But Britain's oyster supply suffered the same fate as America's. Overfishing and pollution wiped them out, pushing them into luxury territory. So were oysters really junk food? Nutritionally, no. Oysters are packed with protein, iron, and zinc. In fact, they're one of the most nutrient-dense foods you can eat. But junk food in the 1800s wasn't about calories or health. It was about price and availability. If it was cheap, fast, and everywhere, it was junk. And oysters fit the bill perfectly. What's wild is that oysters didn't just feed people, they shaped culture. Entire communities built their economy around oyster harvesting. Street vendors had their own oyster songs and jingles, kind of like the 19th century version of the ice cream truck. Imagine kids running to the corner, not for popsicles, but for a salty oyster slurped straight from the shell. It's a piece of urban history that's mostly forgotten today, overshadowed by oysters' modern reputation as luxury dining. Fast forward to the 21st century, and oysters are firmly back in the luxury zone. At a trendy restaurant, you might pay $20 for a half dozen on the half shell. They're served on ice, maybe with a mignonette or lemon wedge, and they come with an aura of sophistication. But at their core, they're the same oysters that were once eaten by coal miners, sailors, and dock workers for pennies. Same food, different story. People love the irony of oysters. The idea that something so elegant today was once working-class grub makes for a good story, and it's true. But oysters aren't unique. Lobsters were once poor man's food given to prisoners. Kale was just a garnish until it became a health craze. Food has a funny way of climbing the social ladder, and oysters are a shining example. So what's today's oyster? Maybe the hot dog. Or the chicken nugget. Cheap, everywhere, kind of questionable, but beloved. Imagine a future where nuggets are rare, carefully farmed, and sold at $10 a piece in fancy bistros. It sounds ridiculous now, but so did the idea of $4 oysters in the 1800s. So, were oysters once considered junk food? Absolutely. They were cheap, abundant, and devoured by everyone. But scarcity and pollution transformed them into a high-class delicacy. Here's the twist. Oysters themselves didn't change. We did. What was once street food is now fine dining simply because we ate too much and ruined the supply. The oyster went from being the French fry of the sea to the champagne of seafood. So the next time you shell out $25 for a plate of oysters, remember, you're not just eating a luxury item, you're eating history. And who knows? Maybe in 100 years, people will be serving chicken nuggets on silver platters, calling them heritage cuisine. If you enjoyed this video, please check out our other bingeable channels. Thank you for watching. If you have suggestions for our next video, feel free to share them in the comments below. We'll be sure to give you an acknowledgement for your contribution.